The 1940s were the hardest decade Britain had ever faced, a nation emerging from the devastation of the Second World War. Factories that had been building aircraft and weapons now trying to remember how to build cars. And the British public, exhausted, patient, and desperately hopeful, was waiting. They waited for cars that would give them freedom. What many of them got was something far less worthy of that wait. Today on UK Car Vault, we are counting down 10 of the most hated British cars of the 1940s. And by the time we reach number 1, you will meet a car so fundamentally embarrassing that it became a symbol of everything post-war Britain was trying not to be. Let's begin. At number 10, the Bond minicar Mark A, launched in 1948 by Sharp's Commercials in Preston. A three-wheeled microcar that arrived in post-war Britain with one very clear promise: cheap, basic transport for a nation that could afford nothing better. On that single narrow promise, it delivered. The 122cc Villiers engine made it extraordinarily economical. The fiberglass body kept weight to an absolute minimum, and the price was genuinely accessible to buyers who had very little to spend. But the Bond minicar was not a car in any meaningful sense of the word. It had no reverse gear on early models. Maneuvering in tight spaces required the driver to physically lift the front end. The single front wheel and minimal engineering made the handling an experience that demanded constant concentration. In wet conditions, which in Britain means most conditions, the minicar's behavior required careful management from drivers who had not necessarily bargained for that level of involvement. The Bond minicar existed because nothing better was available at the price. That is the kindest thing that can honestly be said about it. At number 9, the Morris 8 Series E occupied a peculiar position in post-war Britain. It was a pre-war car, launched originally in 1938, that Morris continued selling after the war because they had nothing new to replace it with. Families who walked into Morris showrooms in the late 1940s looking for a modern post-war car were handed something designed before the conflict had even begun. The separate chassis, the upright styling, the 918cc side valve engine, all of it belonged to another era entirely. The performance was modest, even by the standards of the 1930s. By the late 1940s, it felt genuinely antiquated. Carrying a family at any speed above the gently unhurried produced an experience that reminded everyone in the car of its limitations. Morris knew the 8 Series E was outdated. They were working on replacements, but in the meantime, they sold what they had. And what they had was a pre-war car sold to a post-war public at a post-war price. The families who bought it deserved something that belonged to the decade they were actually living in. At number 8, Standard Motor Company faced the same problem as most British manufacturers in the immediate post-war years. The factories had been converted to war production. Starting car production again meant reviving old designs while new ones were developed. The Standard 8 of 1945 was essentially a pre-war design pushed back into production with minimal changes. The 1021cc engine was familiar, which is another way of saying it was old. The styling was upright and narrow in ways that made it look like it had arrived from a different decade. Because it had. The interior offered the kind of austerity that post-war Britain was supposed to be leaving behind. Basic instrumentation, minimal comfort, a cabin that prioritized cost reduction over the well-being of the people sitting in it. Standard improved and replaced it as the decade progressed, but the families who purchased the 1945 8 in those immediate post-war years found themselves driving a car whose best years were already behind it, before they had even signed the paperwork. It was transport, just barely. And in 1945, that had to be enough. At number 7, the Jowett Javelin was in many ways one of the most genuinely advanced British cars of the late 1940s. A flat-4 engine, torsion bar suspension, aerodynamic styling that felt genuinely modern. Jowett had produced something that deserved to succeed. But the early production models carried reliability problems that undermined every genuine strength the car possessed. The engine developed big-end bearing failures with a consistency that suggested the development process had been concluded before the engineering problems were fully resolved. Owners who had been attracted by the Javelin's genuine technical sophistication found themselves dealing with breakdowns that more conservative and less ambitious rivals simply did not produce. The gap between the car's promise and its reliability was painful precisely because the promise was so genuine. Jowett was a small company without the resources to fix the problems quickly. By the time improvements arrived, the reputation had been established. The Javelin deserved better than its early production quality allowed it to demonstrate. It is a 1940s story that combines genuine brilliance with genuine failure in almost equal measure.
At number 6, the Hillman Minx Phase 1 returned to production in 1945 after the wartime manufacturing pause. And like so many British cars of that immediate post-war period, it returned as essentially the same car that had left. The pre-war Minx design was pushed back into showrooms for a public that had no alternatives and therefore accepted what they were given. The 1185cc side valve engine was unchanged. The separate chassis was unchanged. The styling was unchanged. What had changed was the world around it, the expectations of buyers, the competition beginning to emerge from Europe, the sense that cars should be getting better rather than simply reappearing. The Minx Phase 1 was not a dishonest car. It was simply a car that had run out of road, a design that had exhausted its development potential and was being asked to continue beyond that point because nothing had been prepared to take its place. Roots Group improved the Minx progressively through its various phases, but Phase 1 carried the weight of wartime stagnation and post-war impatience simultaneously.
At number 5, the Austin 8 had been launched in 1939. By the time Austin revived it for post-war production the following decade, it was already carrying the burden of interrupted development and an engineering foundation that had never been particularly ambitious. The 900cc engine produced performance that was adequate only in the most charitable interpretation of that word. A full family load on any kind of incline transformed the driving experience from merely modest to genuinely challenging. The interior was sparse in ways that suggested Austin had made a conscious decision to spend as little as possible on the comfort of the people who would actually live with the car. The seats were functional. The headroom was acceptable. Everything else was an afterthought. Corrosion was an early and persistent visitor. The body steel and the rust protection applied were inadequate for British conditions, and British conditions wasted no time in demonstrating that fact. The Austin 8 existed to fill a gap in a market that had very few options. It filled that gap with something that fell some distance short of what the families using it genuinely needed.
At number 4, the Singer 9 Roadster occupied an interesting position in the late 1940s British market. A small sports car aimed at buyers who wanted something more exciting than the standard family saloons on offer. The 1074cc engine gave it a performance edge over the ordinary family cars of the period. The open bodywork and the sporting pretensions attracted buyers who had dreamed during the war years of something more exciting than purely functional transport. But the Singer 9 Roadster delivered its excitement alongside a set of compromises that sporting buyers found difficult to accept. The handling was unpredictable in conditions that British weather produced regularly. The open body offered exposure to the elements that tested the commitment of even the most enthusiastic owners. Build quality was inconsistent. Singer was a small manufacturer working with limited resources in a difficult economic environment. The gaps between ambition and execution were visible in ways that disappointed buyers who had expected more. The 9 Roadster attracted people who wanted something special and gave them something that was merely unusual. In the late 1940s, that distinction mattered.
At number 3, the Rover 10 P2 returned to limited production after the war, as Rover worked to restart manufacturing at their Solihull factory. And it returned carrying every year of its pre-war origin visibly and uncomfortably. The 1389cc engine was a known quantity, reliable in the most basic sense, but entirely without development potential. Rover knew this. The P2 was a stopgap while proper post-war models were prepared. The problem was that families buying it were not always aware they were purchasing a stopgap. The styling was formal and upright in the manner of a previous decade. The interior was well finished by the standards of its original era, but by post-war expectations, it felt like stepping backward rather than forward. The separate chassis and traditional construction made the Rover 10 P2 feel heavy and ponderous on roads that were now being shared with lighter, more modern machinery from other manufacturers. Rover had better things coming. The P3 and eventually the P4 would restore the company's reputation significantly. But the families who bought the 10 P2 in those immediate post-war years paid for something that belonged in a museum more than a driveway.
At number 2, the Wolseley 8 was another casualty of the post-war manufacturing restart. A pre-war design brought back into production because it existed and because nothing better was immediately ready to take its place. The 918cc engine was shared with the Morris 8, a unit that had never been particularly impressive and had not improved during the years of wartime inactivity. Performance was minimal. The Wolseley name suggested quality that the 8's mechanicals could not support. The interior offered the traditional Wolseley touches, illuminated badge, slightly richer trim than the Morris equivalent, but these cosmetic gestures sat uncomfortably on a mechanical foundation that was simply not good enough for a car charging Wolseley prices. Buyers who paid the premium for the Wolseley name expected to receive something meaningfully better than the Morris 8 they were consciously choosing to avoid. What they received was largely the same car in a more expensive coat. The Wolseley 8 represents one of the 1940s most straightforward disappointments: a great name, a modest car, and a gap between the two that buyers had every right to find unacceptable. And here we are at number 1, the car that became a symbol of post-war British manufacturing failure, the Crossley Regis. Crossley Motors had a long and distinguished history. Founded in Manchester, builders of quality cars for decades, a name that carried genuine respect in British motoring circles. The Regis, produced in the immediate post-war period, was supposed to represent Crossley's return to civilian car production, a fresh start, a demonstration that one of Britain's historic manufacturers had survived the war and was ready to contribute to the nation's recovery. What it demonstrated instead was the consequence of attempting to restart car production without adequate resources, without sufficient development time, and without the quality controls that a car bearing a respected name demanded. The build quality was inconsistent to the point of embarrassment. Cars left the factory in conditions that would have been unacceptable in any normal manufacturing environment. Mechanical problems appeared early and resisted resolution. The electrical systems were unreliable. The body construction was poor. The motoring press was not kind. Buyers were not forgiving. And Crossley, faced with the combination of poor product quality, difficult economic conditions, and a reputation now associated with failure rather than the heritage it had spent decades building, could not recover. Crossley ceased car production shortly after. A company with a genuinely distinguished history ended its automotive story with a car that embodied everything post-war Britain was
10 cars, 10 failures, 10 reminders that even the hardest times do not excuse the delivery of something unworthy to people who have no other choice. The 1940s were genuinely difficult for British manufacturing. The constraints were real, the challenges were enormous. But difficulty is an explanation, not an excuse. The families who bought these cars needed them to work. Many of them did not. From these failures came hard lessons, and from those lessons, eventually, came the cars that defined British motoring for the decades that follow. Leave a comment below. We read every single comment. And if you love British motoring history, subscribe to UK Car Vault. We'll keep telling the stories worth remembering.